Hi everybody, this is Kevin and welcome back to another video. And today, I would like to share my thoughts on the original Final Fantasy III on the NES. Although I played the Pixel Remaster version on the PS5, which is as close to the original NES version as you can get, because despite the fact that this game originally released all the way back in 1990, it has received the least amount of re-releases over the years. Luckily, we can now play the Pixel Remaster version, but before that, the only version of Final Fantasy III that you could play in North America was the 2006 Nintendo DS remake, which, as the name suggests, remake, completely redoes the game, changing the pixel graphics that you saw in Final Fantasy 1 and 2 to more of a chibi style, very similar to Final Fantasy 4. I should have double checked before recording this review. I don't know which one came out first, but I do know with Final Fantasy 4, they also re-released that on a number of consoles such as the PlayStation 1, the Game Boy Advance, even the PSP, and with the PSP version, they called that the Final Fantasy 4 Anthology. I believe they had the interlude and the after years too, which were like separate games telling the story after Final Fantasy 4 ended. But we'll save that for the Final Fantasy 4 review, I suppose. My point here is the only way I played this game back in the day was on the DS version. And as I said, they changed things with the chibi style. I think there was voice acting in that as well. I do know there was voice acting in Final Fantasy 4, but with Final Fantasy 3, they added some more enemies. I think there were super bosses, optional dungeons. I do know they added more job classes in the DS remake. And they had changed the Onion Knight to Freelancer, which I'm so happy to say in the Pixel Remaster, it remains Onion Knight, which is just such a cute title, especially for the starting job. I prefer that over Freelancer, because that just seems so generic, you know? But I'm going to dub Final Fantasy III the Forgotten Final Fantasy game. It's very similar to 2 in a certain sense, in that it started a lot of trends that would go on to continue in pretty much every Final Fantasy that followed it. Whereas 2, everyone says how much they hate it. I actually did a review of that if you want to check it out. I love Final Fantasy 2. In fact, I think of the 3 NES Final Fantasy games, I think 2 is my favorite. It still is. But I do really love 3. I can't stand the disrespect that 2 gets. And 3, in a certain sense, gets disrespect as well, because a lot of people just say it's the inferior version of Final Fantasy V, which to an extent I agree, because Final Fantasy V mainly takes the job system, which debuted in Final Fantasy III, and improves it, along with adding more interesting characters and a better story. But 3, I mean, there's so many things that 3 brings to the table that, like I said, goes on to inspire the later titles, namely the job system, the summons. As Chocobos made their debut in Final Fantasy II, a couple of creatures make their debut in Final Fantasy III, which I'll get to in the screenshots. And I really enjoyed my time with this one. It's a game you sort of owe to yourself to play, especially since it's so easily available now with the Pixel Remasters, because number one, they're all relatively short. I think Final Fantasy 1 took me around 8 hours, Final Fantasy 2 10 hours, Final Fantasy 3 12 hours, so they're all relatively short games. And, you know, if you consider yourself a big Final Fantasy fan, you just get the Pixel Remaster on whichever console, the Switch, PS4, PS5, Steam, whatever you need to do, and play them, because they're great games, lots of fun, and I had a blast. Now, you hear in the background right now, we're listening to Eternal Wind, which is the overworld theme of Final Fantasy III, of course by the great Nobuo Uematsu, and this is the arranged version, so it sounds different, obviously, than the original chiptune from the NES, but man, the music is superb. It's incredible how it stands the test of time so well. And one thing I really like too about the overworld is this is another trend that began in Final Fantasy III and would continue in other games, notably the next one, Final Fantasy IV, in having dual worlds. In that, in Final Fantasy III, you start on a floating continent, and then you continue the story, make your way off it, and there's two worlds, essentially. and that kind of carries over in Final Fantasy IV with the moon, and even the underworld, the dwarves, and that also carries over in some other Final Fantasy titles, so I thought that was really cool. Let's start right here. So, as I said, in Final Fantasy II, we saw the debut of Chocobos. Well, in Final Fantasy III, of course, the Chocobos return, but we also see the debut of the big boy, the Fat Chocobo, which serves an in-game mechanic in that, well, in the original NES version, you have limited inventory space. Thankfully, in the Pixel Remaster, you can carry as many items as you want, and you know, you would call the Fat Chocobo to hold on to your items because he's taking a nap. So here, hold on to these items, big boy. Don't eat them though. So I thought that was pretty fun. And the reason for that, having the limited item space, is because if you're constantly changing your jobs, you know, you're not gonna. If you're using, let's say, the monk, he doesn't need weapons. He's actually more powerful. You can get claws, I think, or tonfas, but he's actually more powerful not having weapons. But say you want to change back to the warrior, you need your sword and shield. So you need to constantly change your inventory around, which is pretty cool. And they actually went back to the magic charge system. So in Final Fantasy II, they added MP, but in this game, they went back to the charge system from Final Fantasy I, and you kind of have to, like, again, use your job classes to your advantage. Obviously, the white mage uses white magic, healing spells. Black mage uses, you know, fire, thunder, blizzard. Then you have the red mage who can use both and also use a sword and shield, so he's more offensive. Then later on, you get the evoker and the summoner, as the name suggests. Geomancer to alter the terrains. Bards, rangers, all sorts of interesting job classes, although obviously some overshadow others. I think my endgame team ended up being a dragoon, a devoured, a black belt, and the magus, which is the more powerful black mage. But anyway, moving on to another debut in this game, we have our friends, the Moogles. Please, Kupo, it's too dangerous in there. Yes, the Moogles indeed made their debut in Final Fantasy III, which, how do you not love the Moogles? And they would go on to pretty much appear in every single game. I think 6 is still the only Final Fantasy game where there's a playable Moogle in Mog. And there's actually a couple more. Isn't there the other scenario with Locke and Terra where the Moogles defend you and there's a party of a few of them? We should get another Moogle party member in the next... In Final Fantasy 17, there better be another playable Moogle. And I guess Kate Sith, but isn't that just a robot? I don't really know. Anyway, Final Fantasy III also sees a debut in Summons. Now, the Summons, they sort of appeared in the earlier titles with Bahamut. He was in the first Final Fantasy game, and then Leviathan was in Final Fantasy II. But now you can actually use summons to call and aid you in battle with the Evoker and the Summoner job class, which the Evoker is the weak version, the one, the starting one, and then you upgrade to Summoner later on. And you have such summons as Chocobos, and then of course later on you'll find Odin, who makes his debut in Final Fantasy III, and then of course goes on to be rather important in other games. I think his most important role may have been Final Fantasy VIII, actually. But Odin appears here. There's Leviathan. And then Bahamut. That was pretty cool. And Bahamut, you actually fight him early on, and you have to run. You can't defeat him because he's too powerful. And the game also has a pretty good sense of humor with the characters that show up. There's this dude you meet, Daish, and he says, "Gotta be upfront with you all. I've got amnesia. I can't remember a thing except my own name." Like, stupid lines that like this really make me laugh. And I don't know if it's intentional to be that funny or it's just a limited text space, but I thought it was very charming. There's a number of characters who join you, not in the sense that they join you in battle, but they'll follow you around until you get to the next area, and they have to fulfill their purpose in the plot. Similar to Final Fantasy II, in that game you had Firion, Maria, and Guy, and then the fourth party member would constantly rotate in. Like you had Minwu, Joseph, Rickard, Leon. You had all these people join you as the story went along. In this case, your 4 party members remain in the party, but you'll have someone tag along for the next sequence in the story. So, yeah, he remembers. He gets over his bout of amnesia, and he name drops the Ancients, which again, I like to poke a little fun at the Final Fantasy VII fanboys because they go on about Aerith a lot, and I mentioned how in Final Fantasy II, you know, Aerith wasn't the first important, meaningful character death in a Final Fantasy game. That started in Final Fantasy II, and they call her a Cetra in Final Fantasy VII, but she's a descendant of the Ancients. And here we have Daish, one of the remaining Ancients. So the Ancients began in Final Fantasy 3, not 7. Take that, you Final Fantasy 7 fanboys. Sorry, I just had to. But yeah, just more goofy dialogue that I was like laughing my ass off when I read this. You go in here and you talk to some of the soldiers, and he says, "The king refuses to hear counsel. If anyone dares to speak out, he puts them to death right then and there." Like, whoa, the king isn't fucking around. I don't know, man. I just thought that line was great. But in the end, you end up meeting the 4 warriors. So you're the 4 warriors of light. But in the final battle, you end up confronting the 4 warriors of dark. And they help you, and they talk about the balance of light and darkness. And people like to get on my boy Tetsuya Nomura about his light and darkness, and that's a very Kingdom Heartsy, if you will, theme, which I love Kingdom Hearts, by the way. But they like to criticize him about that. Although I don't think Nomura, he might have been involved in Final Fantasy IV, but I do know he got involved in Final Fantasy V because he was involved in the job classes, and he also created the Tonberry. So that iconic character, that's Tetsuya Nomura. And then he was involved with Setzer and Shadow and their stories in Final Fantasy VI. But I don't think Nomura started with Final Fantasy III. I could be wrong, though, but I thought that was fun. They all end up helping in the end. All your friends who you met along the way help. Daish comes back, which he jumped in that furnace early in the game, and I thought he died, but he came back. So this is maybe the advent of the fake out deaths in the Final Fantasy games. There are some actual real deaths in Final Fantasy 3, but there's a couple of fake out deaths, and we'll get to more of that in Final Fantasy 4, which has a lot of fake out deaths. But all our heroes come save the day. Oh, here are the fellows. So as I mentioned earlier, there were the 2 different, you know, the floating continent and then the other continent. This is the other continent, and you have these guys, the 4 fellows, and they're like roleplay that they're the 4 warriors of light, and they're a bunch of has-been old men, and they're like, oh, give it a rest already. It reminded me of the old timers from the anime Gun Sword, and I was just dying, man. It's the old timers, and the old timers come in at the very end and save the day and help us, and the old man Doga shows up and says, "We need one of you to come aid the warriors of light." And they're all just called the fellows, but all of a sudden one of them changes to the lead fellow. And he's like, "Oh, my time to shine has finally come. I'll save the day." So the fellows get to save the day. And after losing, you know, it's a boss fight. This might have been, actually no, Final Fantasy II. It was a boss fight where you actually died. In this one, you die again. And the lead fellow, "You can't give up." So we get up, and all the people are there. There's Sid to the left with his beard. Which, yes, Sid made his debut in Final Fantasy II. And there's a side quest where you have to give Mrs. Sid an elixir. There's a couple side quests in this game, which is cool. But, there's the Cloud of Darkness, the final boss. And, yeah, that's really it. The end. You save the world. So, a really sweet game, a charming game. I had a lot of fun with it. It's kind of weird because I'm happy to be finishing all these games relatively quickly now after spending hundreds of hours on the Trails games. And there are funny character moments, like I mentioned with Daish with the amnesia, the fellows, the king putting people to death right then and there. But I don't know, man. I'm kind of waiting to get invested in the characters like I was with the Trails series. I hate to compare everything to the Trails series now, but the way I look at things is Kevin before discovering the Trail series and Kevin after discovering the Trail series, and how, like, my view on video games has changed since then. But, you know, I'll have to play a longer game again, I suppose. But I love this game. I dub it the Forgotten Final Fantasy game. I still think my contrarian in me says 2 is the best of the NES games, but I respect what 3 did for the series, what it went on to inspire with the Moogles, the Fat Chocobo, the Summons, the job classes. We'll get to 4 soon. I'm going to play 4 next. Because with the job classes, the characters who join you in 4 all have their roles. Like, you have Cecil, who's the Dark Knight. You have Kane, who's the Dragoon. Rydia's the Summoner. Rosa's the White Mage. Yang is the Monk. You have the characters all have their roles, so you can't change the job classes. But that's an example of what the job classes went on to influence. And then in 5, you get the job classes again, and you can do what you want. But yeah, it's a very important game in the history of Final Fantasy, and I think if you are a Final Fantasy fan, you owe it to yourself to play it. It's so readily available with the Pixel remasters. If you want to go out on a limb, I think it's like $70 to get all 6 games, but you can buy them all individually. They range though. I think some are $10, some are $15, and some are $20, because 4, 5, and 6 do get longer, and 1, 2, and 3 are shorter, but that's because they're on the NES. But yeah, it was a fun game. I enjoyed it. Like I said, definitely recommend it. And it's an important game. I hate, because I said it too in this review, and I hate people who do say it, but you know, it should be more than just the lesser version of Final Fantasy V. It should be respected for what it's done to the franchise of summons and everything else I mentioned that it was the debut of, and having some meaningful characters tag along with you. And They gave the Warriors of Light more of a personality than they did in the first Final Fantasy game. Although, I think the characters in 2 are better. They're just more well-written. But anyway, let me know what you guys thought in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned for more videos coming soon. And most likely, the next review will be of Final Fantasy IV. Because, you know, I said I was playing some East games for a while. I wanted to take a break from that, play Final Fantasy III. And now that I play 3, I'm like, I gotta keep going, so I'm gonna play Final Fantasy IV next. Which, by the way, these are all replays. As I mentioned, I played 1 and 2 on the Game Boy Advance way back when. I played the DS version of this. I played the Game Boy Advance versions of 4, 5, and 6. And then, well, you know the rest. The PlayStation 1, 2. I played pretty much every Final Fantasy with the exception of the MMOs 12 and 16. But that's all. So thanks, guys. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you later. Peace out.
99.